Good morning, sunshines. Welcome to another exciting day at Theater Appreciation. Yay! For those of you who are assigned Lysistrata as your play to analyze, if you just send me the analysis, I will disseminate that to the rest of the class later today. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read the play yet, before we talk about it, I figured I'd let you watch this little short video that is very good at explaining the basic plot lines of Lysistrata, so enjoy.
To put an end to the Peloponnesian War, Lysistrata persuades women from all over Greece to go on a sex strike until the men agree to make peace. Lysistrata hatches a plan with the older women to seize control of the Acropolis, where the city treasury is kept. The men attempt to smoke the women out of the Acropolis, but the women extinguish the fires and triumphantly drench the men. When a magistrate, Aproboulos, arrives to retrieve funds for the war, Lysistrata berates him about the losses that the women have been forced to bear. Women have to take on more than twice your burden. Firstly, it's us giving birth to children, then we send them off as soldiers. The women dress the magistrate up in their clothes and send him away humiliated. As the strike continues, the sex-starved men of Greece become increasingly desperate. A Spartan herald approaches the Acropolis and finds the magistrate outside. He explains the desperate situation of his countrymen, and they both agree that a treaty is required. Delegations from Athens and Sparta meet to discuss the treaty. Lysistrata appears with her naked handmaid, Peace. The men's eyes are fixated on Peace, as Lysistrata chastises them for treating each other so badly and reminds them that they previously helped one another. The Spartan and Athenian leaders guiltily agree and decide on land rights to end the war. Lysistrata gives the women back to their men and joins the celebration of peace.
As you can see, it is a very serious play on some levels, but it is presented in a very comic manner, which is definitely a different approach than tragedy. Tragedy, again, tends to deal with people who are higher in society than we are. We'll talk more about the differences between tragedy and comedy when we talk about what Aristotle's rules are. But in comedy, you tend to deal with people who are at least your level, if not below you in society. And so the lead character in Lysistrata is a woman named Lysistrata who is merely a housewife. She has nothing particularly famous about her. She just is someone who misses her husband, or at least parts of her husband. One of the things about the play is this idea of double entendre. Double entendre is something when they're talking about something and they mean something else. So for instance, early on in the play, when the ladies are coming together, they are congratulating each other on how nicely groomed their shrubs and their bushes are. I guess technically they would be talking about a bush, I guess, in some level, but they're not talking about their gardening. That is, in case you were wondering about that. Now, some things are blatant out there. Again, when they're talking about a dingus or a dildo, they're talking about what you think they're talking about. So this play borders on the obscene. Certainly, for those of you who might have been offended, I don't believe the reason Aristophanes wrote this play was to offend. Now, it might have that effect on you, and if it does, I apologize. Again, that is not the intent whatsoever. I think the major thrust of the play, sorry, is an anti-war play. I think the reason Aristophanes wrote this play is to think of the most ridiculous scenario he could think of and put it in the guise of standing up against the war. Again, we talked about the Peloponnesian War beginning in the middle of the 5th century BC, which was basically a civil war among the Greek city-states that would just seem to go on and on. It was non-ending. Again, sometimes certain city-states would win, sometimes other city-states would win, but you just had this nagging thing in society where there was this undercurrent that was just a horrible feeling to be at war with your friends and neighbors for all these years. And so they're developed, and again, obviously Socrates was a big part of this developing undercurrent against the war. But Aristophanes was one of the people who in theater began writing plays that would express this anti-war sentiment. Now, before we get into Aristophanes, a little bit about comedies. First of all, the first evidence we have of comedy was what's called a satyr play. A satyr, again in Greek religion, Greek philosophy, you had the 12 Greek gods, and then Hades, of course, below. But you also had these creatures named satyrs. They were half man, half goat. If you've ever seen the movie Hercules, Philoctetes is the person who teaches Hercules how to play the flute and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, he's a satyr, and he's a little devilish character that goes around and does things like trips you and makes you your umbrella turn inside out if it's raining, or just not huge things that the gods would deal with, not life and death issues, but just when you stub your toe, or just everyday concerned worries that just get in your way of having a happy life. The satyrs, and again, Greek religion, were considered to be the source of those evils. And so as the number of audience members evolved, again, when you're talking about 534 with Thespis coming out, my guess is there could have been the original priest plus a few people there. Let's just give it 100 for a good number. Probably less than that, but just to give it a number, 100 people standing around watching this ceremony. By the time of the award ceremonies, by the time we're having city-states compete, you're talking about the growth to 10, maybe 15,000 people. Again, the difference between telling 100 people to be quiet, we're about to start, and 10,000 people to be quiet, we're going to start. I think what they started doing was writing these little comedic plays called satyr plays. It was sort of like if you've ever seen the taping of a television show. Usually you'll have a warm-up comic who'll come out and do a little 5-minute or 10-minute riff just to get the audience used to sitting down, being quiet, and listening to what's happening. And so you would have these little satyr plays, and they were devilish little plays that would make fun of audience members. They would talk about how fat they were, especially the people who were the judges of the plays, at least the ones we have existent. And so they weren't necessarily very nice, but they would have caused the audience to say, oh, the play is about to begin. And so the first evidence we have of that type of play was in 487 BC. Again, eventually the playwrights would write the 3 shows in the trilogy and the satyr play. By 442 BC, there's a completely second festival called the Lenaii Festival, Lenaia Festival, and this is just a competition among comedic playwrights. Aristophanes in 462 did compete in the regular festival and wrote comedies and did win as a comedian in those festivals. But eventually it was felt that comedies, because they just were a different, they didn't have to depend upon myth, they were about the current issues, they just were a different type of thing. And so comedies started having their own festival in 442 BC. The last Dionysian festival, the last tragedy festival, in other words, was in 372. So another 70 years later was the last tragedy festival. And the last comedy festival wasn't for another 200 years, it was in 154 BC. So comedy had a more powerful, quicker influence, also had a more lasting influence than the tragedies. Now, of all those dates and times that I've told you about, we still only have 11 of Aristophanes' plays, and then the 32 tragedies that we also have. So even though we know that all these plays are being produced, we don't have any scripts from them, and I'm going to tell you the reason is because as initially the plays were performed by people who were educated, to be literate, let's talk about that. When I say that someone is illiterate, it doesn't mean they're dumb. It just means that they haven't learned how to read or write language. Now, for instance, in Spanish, I am illiterate. I know enchilada, I know burrito, chalupa, yes. I know baño, I know cerveza. So the important words I got. But as far as being conversational or being able to read and write it, I'm illiterate in that language. Being illiterate doesn't necessarily mean unintelligent. It just means they haven't been taught the language. And so, whereas initially the plays were being performed, the plays of Oedipus Rex, for instance, was performed by members of society who could read and write, and so when Sophocles wrote the play, he was able to hand out the script to the actors, and they were able to learn the lines from the playwright. As time progresses, I'm going to suggest to you, and certainly by the time we get to the Romans, the next class period, the people who are performing the plays are going to become more and more illiterate because they're going to become lesser and lesser in society, to the point where it's probably the slaves of the people who are presenting the show who are performing the plays. And in that case, you don't necessarily need a written script, because what you need is a scenario. You and Cody are having lunch, what do you say? And the actors would create the scenario, would create the scene, and it could be that that scene is passed down from one generation to the next generation. When we get to Everyman, that probably is true of that show. It probably existed for about 300 or 400 years before somebody actually took it and wrote it down. So when we read Everyman, we're reading a version of the play that appeared in the 16th century, whereas the play had existed for 400 or 500 years before that. But it was something that, because people couldn't read and write, it was something that there was not an official script for until somebody actually, over time, said this play is popular enough, we're going to write it down for other generations and other people to read. Yes? And so, again, just a little sidebar on illiteracy. Aristophanes, particularly, he lived from 450 BC to 385 BC. He's considered by many to be the father of comedies. Again, mostly I'm going to say that is true because the plays that were prior to Aristophanes were not handed down to us. He certainly is the one who popularized them, to the extent of he was the first one to win an award at the Dionysian Festival based on writing a comedy. So that is certainly true. So he at least is the person who popularized comedies. Again, we have evidence of about 40 plays existent. In the Lanai Festival, it was just one play. There were no trilogies. So it was a much quicker festival, and it was generally the week, if you performed the week of the Dionysian Festival, the Lanai Festival was basically that weekend as everybody prepared to go home and all that sort of stuff. And you had 3 or 4 city-states compete in the same day, as opposed to having a day for each city-state to compete, which would be the way they did at the Dionysian Festival. We also know that Aristophanes had 3 sons, and they all became comedic playwrights. Again, we don't have any examples of their plays around. Here's a little video introducing Aristophanes to you. I think it's very good. It also talks about how comedies came about and all that sort of mess. Enjoy.
At the annual Athenian Drama Festival in 426 BC, a comic play called The Babylonians, written by a young poet named Aristophanes, was awarded first prize. But the play's depiction of Athens' conduct during the Peloponnesian War was so controversial that afterwards a politician named Cleon took Aristophanes to court for slandering the people of Athens in the presence of foreigners. Aristophanes struck back 2 years later with a play called The Knights. In it, he openly mocked Cleon, ending with Cleon's character working as a lowly sausage seller outside the city gates. This style of satire was a consequence of the unrestricted democracy of 5th century Athens and is now called Old Comedy. Aristophanes' plays, the world's earliest surviving comic dramas, are stuffed full of parodies, songs, sexual jokes, and surreal fantasy. They often use wild situations, like a hero flying to heaven on a dung beetle, or a net cast over a house to keep the owner's father trapped inside, in order to subvert audience expectations. And they've shaped how comedy's been written and performed ever since. The word comedy comes from the ancient Greek komos, revel, and oid, singing, and it differed from its companion art form, tragedy, in many ways. Where ancient Athenian tragedies dealt with the downfall of the high and mighty, their comedies usually ended happily. And where tragedy almost always borrowed stories from legend, comedy addressed current events. Aristophanes' comedies celebrated ordinary people and attacked the powerful. His targets were arrogant politicians, war-mongering generals, and self-important intellectuals. Exactly the people who sat in the front row of the theatre where everyone could see their reactions. As a result, they were referred to as komodoumenoi, those made fun of in comedy. Aristophanes' vicious and often obscene mockery held these leaders to account, testing their commitment to the city. One issue in particular inspired much of Aristophanes' work, the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. In Peace, written in 421 BC, a middle-aged Athenian frees the embodiment of peace from a cave where she'd been exiled by profiteering politicians. Then, in the aftermath of a crushing naval defeat for Athens in 411 BC, Aristophanes wrote Lysistrata. In this play, the women of Athens grow sick of war and go on a sex strike until their husbands make peace. Other plays use similarly fantastic scenarios to skewer topical situations, such as in Clouds, where Aristophanes mocked fashionable philosophical thinking. The hero, Strepsiades, enrolls in Socrates' new philosophical school, where he learns how to prove that wrong is right and that a debt is not a debt. No matter how outlandish these plays get, the heroes always prevail in the end. Aristophanes also became the master of the parabasis, a comic technique where actors address the audience directly, often praising the playwright or making topical comments and jokes. For example, in Birds, the chorus takes the role of different birds and threatens the Athenian judges that if their play doesn't win first prize, they'll defecate on them as they walk around the city. Perhaps the judges didn't appreciate the joke, as the play came in second. By exploring new ideas and encouraging self-criticism in Athenian society, Aristophanes not only mocked his fellow citizens, but he shaped the nature of comedy itself. Hailed by some scholars as the father of comedy, his fingerprints are visible upon comic techniques everywhere, from slapstick to double acts, to impersonations to political satire. Through the praise of free speech and the celebration of ordinary heroes, his plays made his audience think while they laughed, and his retort to Cleon in 425 BC still resonates today. I'm a comedian, so I'll speak about justice, no matter how hard it sounds to your ears.
Excellent. The other comedic playwright we have a play from is a man named Menander. Menander lived from 342 to 291 BC. Aristophanes' comedies became a school of old comedies. Again, I would say they're much more political and they do have rational reason for having been written. By the time we get to Menander, you have stock characters. It's just plays that are just funny. There's total escape. Again, one of the things that's happening by the time we get to Menander, by the time we get to the end of the 4th century BC, beginning of the 3rd century BC, the Hellenic period has passed. Greece is no longer the dominant power in the Mediterranean region. And so Greek society is having to learn with the fact that they are not as powerful as they once were, and people are just seeking an escape from the everyday, from the mundane. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm going to say plays became less and less about war or about women's power, which again is another thing that Lysistrata can certainly be about. And I would say in today's world, people who do Aristophanes' Lysistrata are doing it as much for the practicalness of women's power as it is doing it for the statement about an anti-war play. But again, I don't think that's the reason Aristophanes, I don't believe, was touting women's power or suffrage or any of that sort of stuff. I think that would have been a stone too far for him. But I don't know. Don't know the man. Maybe he did. The other thing about comedies, before we leave and talk about our good friend Aristotle. The way the festival worked, almost all of Aristotle, the 11 plays we have from Aristophanes, let's put it this way, all end in a communal singing and dancing, coming together, usually men and women partying on into the night. The Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite, had a temple that is right across the backside of the Dionysian festival. And during this time period, the way you would celebrate give your offering to Aphrodite was you would go to the temple, and you would walk in and you would give a monetary offering, and you would be escorted by a priestess back to a smaller chamber. And then that's where you gave your physical offering to Aphrodite. And so I'm going to say, whereas women were not allowed on stage, they certainly were allowed in the audience. And I'm going to say during the course of the comedies, part of what was happening was these priestesses were soliciting, we'll just use that word, patrons to come to the Aphrodite festival after. Now again, Greek society was, Greek marriages were a thing that just established ownership, rights of succession, all that sort of stuff. But in Greek society, you didn't necessarily have a man and a woman pledged to be sexually honest with one another, let's put it that way. As a matter of fact, homosexuality, just to be blunt, was not viewed as a sin. It was not viewed as a bad thing. Sex with a man was viewed just like sex with a woman. It was just a sexual act. And so you're going to hear, probably we talked about a little bit about Alexander the Great. One of the things you're going to hear is that he had a lover on his campaigns at war, and that is absolutely true. But again, in Greek society, that was not a bad thing. It was just something that the Greeks did. Again, just a totally different attitude about sex than we have today in our modern world, just to be out there and blunt with it, while we're talking about Lysistrata. Cool. All right, let's get on to from the ridiculous to the sublime, the poetics. Another thing that we talked about several of the Greek philosophers. We talked about how Plato had written a book called The Republic, and in the Republic, Book 10, he had argued that theater, because it is a lie based on a lie, should not be included in a utopian society. And at his death, again, he left his university to his second best student, and which caused Aristotle, who was his best student, to seek employment otherwise. And so he wound up with this job teaching Alexander the Great in Macedonia. And while he was there, he started looking at the teachings of Plato and decided that he may have been wrong in several instances. The one that we care about, because we're studying theater appreciation, is that he wrote a book called The Poetics, Aristotle did, in which he argues that theater should be included in a utopian world. That is his thesis in The Poetics. Now, both the Republic and the Poetics are dialogues. They're written as dialogues. The Republic is a dialogue between Plato and Socrates. The Poetics is a dialogue between Aristotle and Plato. Yes? Much of what we think we know about Socrates is from this book, The Republic, in which Plato gives Socrates very sound advice, very sound arguments for his positions, but the book was written by Plato. And so in the Republic, whatever argument Plato is going to espouse is going to be the winning argument. He's not insane. Even though Socrates gives very good rebuttal. Again, the stronger the rebuttal in an argument, the stronger the defense in a football or baseball game, the more powerful champion you are when you win, yes? In the Poetics, Aristotle and Plato are having the discussion, and again, Aristotle wrote it, so at the end of the Poetics, Aristotle's argument is going to come to the fore because, again, Aristotle's not insane, although he gives Plato his good arguments from his defense, yes? Now, one of the things about the Poetics, and I'm going to use this sentence, I'm going to say it slowly, the Poetics is the first systematized treatise of theater. Sounds like an easy sentence. What I mean, you understand what I mean? The first, no one else had done one before. A systematized, in other words, you're going to go by it aspect by aspect. He's going to enumerate every single thing that's a part of a play and tell you exactly how it's done. A treatise is something that tells you how stuff works. So for instance, if you have your little manual for your computer, that is a treatise. If you have, so Aristotle is writing this book in which he's going to defend theater's place in the utopian society. But one of the things he's also going to do is tell you how it works. What is on stage? When you go to see a play, what do you see? what is it happening, how is it working, and in describing all the aspects of the play, he's going to defend theater's place in utopian society. Yes? So, it takes, and again, the books are really just scrolls that they're put out every month or so. They're more like magazines, except they're scrolls. So when I say books, it is not a bound copy of printed material. That doesn't happen. But it took him about 12 years. He started in 335 BC, and he wrote it until his death in 323 BC. In the first book of the Poetics, he's going to go through and he's going to divide theater into 5 what he calls actions. Now, these are going to be misunderstood. When Aristotle says there are 5 actions in the play, later philosophers like Seneca, when we talk about Rome in the next class period, Seneca is going to misunderstand 5 actions as 5 acts. And the reason that Shakespeare writes in 5 acts is because Seneca is never lost. Aristotle is going to get lost in the muddle. The library is going to get burned, the one in Rome is going to get burned, the one in Alexandria is going to get burned, but the one in Constantinople doesn't get burned, and that's going to be the beginning of the Renaissance when that material is discovered. And that isn't discovered until after Shakespeare writes his plays. And so the rule becomes 5 acts based on the idea that Aristotle said there are 5 actions in the play. Now, the 5 actions in the play, the prologue establishes the coming conflict. Aristotle says in the beginning, somebody comes out and gives you a little, here's what's going to happen, here's what we're here. Now, if you look at Oedipus Rex in your book, it says the word prologue. But what's happening there is not prologue. You have the priest and the citizens of Thebes coming to Oedipus and saying, our Lord, our Savior, our Master, we're starving to death. Please help us find the problem why this plague is here on our city. That's not a prologue. That is action. Now, some editor has come back and put the word prologue in. Why? Because Aristotle says the first action in the play is a prologue. Sophocles didn't know that. Sophocles wrote his play 150 years before this. So when I say that Euripides followed the rules the best, all 18 plays that we have from Euripides all have a prologue. None of the plays of Aeschylus or Sophocles have a prologue. Again, it's just an example of how I think Aristotle is going to use Aristotle figures out how Euripides wrote a play, and that's what he's going to use as his example. Because his plays are all written formulaically, which again is going to make them less entertaining by their nature because you're following a formula than you would if you just had a play that followed wherever the characters led. Yes? In Shakespeare's time, in Romeo and Juliet, you have a character come out and say, 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where they are seen. That's a prologue. Yes? Not action. It's describing what's going to happen. It's going to talk about these 2 lovers and how the fact that their parents can't come to agreement, the lovers are going to die. It tells you that in the prologue. Yes? And so that's what a prologue is. Again, I'm not saying that they all have them. Aristotle just says that's the first action of a play. The second action, according to Aristotle, is the parados, which is the entrance of the chorus. Again, there'll be some singing and dancing where the chorus entered. Again, the chorus ranged in size from 10 to 50. And eventually it becomes a person, 15 people on stage singing and dancing, or in the orchestra, which is the lower section. Then you have a series of scenes or episodes. These would be performed by the actors on stage. Typically, there were 5 scenes. Again, in Sophocles' version of Oedipus Rex, there are 8 scenes. But again, in all of Euripides, there are always 5 scenes. So again, another example of how Euripides followed those rules, whereas the other players may not have. The scenes are interrupted by what are called stasimas, or choral odes. This is where the chorus will sing and dance while the actors on stage are changing their mask, while they go into their little dressing room backstage and come out as they have been Oedipus and come back as Jocasta or whoever it is the masks are going to wear. And then you have go back and forth between the stasimas and the antistasimas, because sometimes, or the strophes and the antistrophes, sometimes, for instance, in Lysistrata, you have half the chorus playing the men and half the chorus playing the women. And sometimes the chorus would sing amongst itself, that sort of thing. So those are strophe and antistrophe. And then, of course, after you have the 5 episodes, in the 5 scenes, you have this thing called the Exodus, where the chorus and the actors go out singing and dancing, which is at the end of the play. And again, I'm going to suggest to you that in Aristophanes' plays, it says they go off singing and dancing together, and I'm going to say they move next door to the bar that is the temple of Aphrodite. Yes? Anyway, so according to Aristotle, though, when you go see a play, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see the chorus come on, you're going to see the actors come out on stage, you're going to see the chorus sing in between the actors' motions, that sort of stuff, and then you're going to see everybody leave. The prologue leads to the parados, which is the entrance of the rest of the chorus, then the scenes and the choreos, and then the Exodus. Cool? Cool. He then divides theater into 6 elements. Now, the 6 elements are the things that comprise what a play is. So, for instance, the first element is plot. Aristotle calls the plot the soul, S-O-U-L, of the drama. And because he listed it first, I'm going to say he thinks the plot is the most important part of the play. Now, I will tell you that the majority of the time, the plot is the most important part of the play. But there are plays and movies that are out there where the character might actually be the most important, or the theme might be the most important thing. But for the most part, the plot is an essential element of the play. I would agree that more often than not, the plot is the most important part. We'll talk more about the plot in a second. The second aspect or second element is character. Character is what distinguishes one person on stage from another. So I'm the size and weight of a pseudolus more than any other character on stage. You have Lysistrata is a female who is the wife of a soldier. Oedipus is a king. Jocasta is his mother, not too ugly, rather desirable. And so Creon is his brother-in-law and his uncle, just to get things worked out. Obviously he's got to be older than Oedipus because he's his brother and his in-law and his uncle. So the character is what distinguishes one person from another in the play. The third aspect, the third element, is theme. This is the main idea or thought of the play. So for instance, Lysistrata, I would say mostly is an anti-war play. It also is a pro-women play. Oedipus, I would say, is that the lesson that I take from Oedipus is that the truth will come out eventually. Because I'm not a big believer in fate or a big believer in destiny, we talked about them both last time. I wanted you to contemplate them both. But I think it was more about the fact that no matter what you've done in your life or what has happened to you in your life, eventually, even though you may have had nothing to do with it, the truth is going to come out. And you're going to have to deal with that, right? You see this all the time where people hide the truth, and as soon as you start running from the truth, it's going to bite you in the patootie. I just want to say patootie. All right, the fourth element, according to Aristotle, is diction. This is the ability of plays to teach language. Again, you didn't have schools for the masses during this time period, but you have 20,000 people attending a play. You learn to use language properly. You know what slang is. You know that ain't a word, except that I just said it twice and you understood it both times. So proper use of language. The fifth element is music. Again, this is the oral component. Again, we don't have copies of Greek music, but we know sort of what they played. They played the tabors, these little tambourines without the reeds. They played lyres, little harp things. They played flutes, and so we can sort of guess what the music sounded like. But again, you have the words that they sang. But again, for instance, one of my good friends, Usher, made a lot of money writing a song called Yeah, in which the lyrics are yeah, 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 yeah. On paper, it doesn't look too impressive, but he put $1 million in his pocket because of it, so more power to Usher. The sixth thing, the final element, is spectacle. Again, we talked a little bit about the periactoi, we talked about the ekaklema, the rolling platforms that came out. We talked about the lifts and the winches and that sort of stuff that brought people from heaven and back into the play and that sort of thing. So there were scenic elements. Again, you also had the costumes and the colors of the costumes, the masks and what they look like and what they symbolize. So all of those are the 6 elements of the theater according to Aristotle. Again, so far we haven't defended the theater's place in utopian society. but we were just defining what theater is. This is what makes it. These are the 5 things you're going to see when you see a play. These are the 6 elements that you're going to have incorporated in the performance. Yes? Now, he goes through and he's going to talk about each element specifically. He's going to talk about them point by point. So his first element, plot being the most important, consists of 4 parts according to Aristotle. He says the first part is exposition. Exposition is the part of the play where you learn who's who and what's what. In Oedipus, I'm going to say there's not a whole lot of exposition. You say, you have the crowd come forward and say, "My king," and Oedipus says, "Yes." And so that's all you get before suddenly you're into what's called the rising action. The rising action is the second part of the play where you are introduced to the conflict. Again, in Oedipus, you have the characters say, "We are starving, we need help. Please figure out why that is." He sends Creon to the oracle who says we need to find the killer of Laius. If you've always wondered who the killer of Laius is, you can't sleep at night because you didn't know who killed Laius, this is going to be a great play. Oh my God, we found out who killed JFK. This is going to be a great movie. Yes? If you could care less about Laius, this is going to be a long day. Because the rest of the play we're talking about who killed Laius. And why, maybe. In Lysistrata, you have the characters come out and you have her criticizing the rest of the characters because they're late. "Ladies, why can't you be on time?" "Oh, we were doing her hair. I'm sorry, I didn't know," whatever. Then finally everybody arrives and then they say, she says, "I have a great plan to end the war." And they're like, "We'll do anything." She says, "Anything, even if it kills you?" "Absolutely." "Well, then we're going to have to do without cock." Okay, see ya, gots to go. Can you say that word in this class? I'm just quoting the quote. Sorry, not to get too salacious. Anyway, the exposition is the part of the play before the play begins, rising action. I'm going to say the introduction of the conflict is what I'm going to call, not Aristotle. I'm going to call it the point of attack. Whenever you are analyzing a script, you always want to figure out exactly where the play begins. And if you're doing a mystery, let's say, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Sixth Sense. Sixth Sense is a 2-hour movie. You don't know what's happening really for a good hour and a half. You think you know. And you think, oh, this little boy is helping this guy figure out the psychological nature. For those of you who've seen it, this is when the wedding ring hits the floor, which is about an hour and a half in the movie, when suddenly you realize what you think you've been watching is not what you're watching. For those of you who haven't watched it, watch it this weekend. It's great. But it is a suspense, and it's about whodunit. Yes? And so the exposition is a very long piece because that's the whole point. When you're finding out who's who and you're trying to figure out who done it, you want to take a little bit longer. Rear Window by Hitchcock. You don't know who even if there has been a crime. You don't even know there has been a crime definitely until you're a good 15 minutes to the end of the movie. Then suddenly everything hits the fan. And suddenly you realize there has been a crime and there has been a reason for this all to happen. Otherwise, it was just a man looking out his rear window and peeping in on his next door neighbors. So again, depending on the type of play it is, exposition can be very short, as in Oedipus Rex, or it can be the majority of the play, as in any kind of mystery, that sort of thing. The rising action, again, I'm going to say is where the conflict is introduced. People always ask me why, maybe you've seen this to be true. You go see a movie and everybody else says it's fantastic. This is true of me when I went to see Titanic. It was probably done before you were born. But there was a movie called Titanic. And before I got to see it, everybody and the dog saw it. And so they all were telling me, "Mike, this movie's fantastic. This movie's fantastic." So I said, okay. So I went expecting to see, I'll give it an 8 out of 10, just because everybody said it was fantastic. I never expect to see a 10. So I go see this movie. It's about a boat that sinks. Now, there's a very interesting scene where they're in a car. That's kind of interesting. There's a very interesting scene where he's drawing her and her jewelry. If you know the movie, you know what I'm talking about. That's very interesting. But for the most part, it's pretty darn predictable. The boat sinks. Tear. Now, let's even say that it's a little better than I thought it was going to be. I expected an 8. Let's say I got a 9. My expectation and the reality are pretty darn close. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen Kangaroo Jack, But when my wife and I were younger, we had 2 daughters, we would alternate children's shows. The kids both wanted to go see all these, movies, the Hercules, Lion King, all this stuff. And so we would alternate. And I was on a hot streak. I got Hercules, I got Lion King, my wife got Thumbelina. She got just, I'm not saying they're bad, they're just not as good as the ones I got to see. Until we went to see Kangaroo Jack. Kangaroo Jack came out, and my daughters both went to see Kangaroo Jack. So I said, all right, my turn, I'll take them to see Kangaroo Jack. Well, I'm going to say my expectations, just because, again, just like I never have a perfect great movie, I never have a perfect bad movie. So let's just go in and say I had a 2 as an expectation. Well, the movie starts, and it's in Australia. That's cool. And there's a kangaroo, and that's cool. Oh, and there's Christopher Walken. Christopher Walken is in it. He's cool. And then it just drones on and on. Nothing. You can tell it's trying to be funny, where people kept getting kicked in the nether regions by a kangaroo. But it's just, I don't know, it drags. And I've never really walked out of a theater or a film experience, but I came real close to walking out that day. And then, it was an opening day. It was a very crowded movie theater, a bunch of 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and my youngest daughter, who was 8, at the end of the movie stood up and said, "That is the greatest film I have seen in my life!" My expectation, my reaction to the film has gone to the point where I tell this story. Now again, I'm not making it a 10, I'll make it a 5. But I went in expecting to see a 2, and I got a 5. So my sense of the movie is, even though there's no way in God's heaven I'm saying that Kangaroo Jack is half the film of Titanic. In my memory, my experience, Titanic is only a little better than I thought it was going to be. Kangaroo Jack is like a lifetime memory I tell, and I'm going to tell at my daughter's wedding. Yes, I'm not going to tell any stories about Titanic at my daughter's wedding. So again, one of the things as people who are studying theater you need to know is that in addition to these elements we're talking about, audiences have a certain expectation of what they're going to experience that they bring with them into the theater. My guess is when you're reading Lysistrata, it did not meet your expectations as far as what you thought a Greek play was going to be. And for those of you who haven't read it and you've heard us talk about it, you're going, what in the world is this play about? So my guess is, I hope you're a little stimulated. Let's see how it works. A little double entendre there. To go read it a little more than you had been before you read it. Anyway, so you got the rising action, which of course that's the problem with this class, it leads to the climax. Now, gentlemen, I have to tell you this. I hate to break it to you. Ladies, you know this. Not everyone has the same climax. I almost said that with a straight face. There are, in the play, Lysistrata, for example, I'm going to forge ahead. In the play Lysistrata, there's the scene, to me, the climactic moment in the play, is the scene between Marine and her husband, Canisius. That may be the way you say it, it's Greek to me. Anyway, he comes to her and he's holding his helmet in front of himself, and he's holding it without his hands. And she says, "Oh yes, I need you so bad, except that I don't want to lay on this sand. I need a cushion." So he has to go find a cushion. And she's like, "Oh, I stink. I haven't bathed in days." So he goes find some lotion. She's like, "Oh no, I need a little perfume." And so he's got to find perfume. It goes on like that for forever. And then finally she leaves him unsatisfied, let's say. To me, that's the funniest scene in the play. But of course, I'm an old married man. But I would say, if in reading the play, that is the climactic scene. No double entendre intended. But as the play is structured, there's a scene later in the play where the peace treaty is signed. That I'm going to say, because the whole play is about they're at war and they want to stop the war, the climactic moment, or the moment where the reversal happens, so structurally the climactic moment is the signing of the peace treaty. Now, again, I'm reading the play. One of the things that happens in production is oftentimes that peace treaty is brought out by a character who is a nude female. Now, in production, I will guarantee you, that scene impresses, usually. Of course, I'm not talking about Betty White again. Although Betty White's a lovely lady. And if you're watching this, Betty, I apologize. I'll come up with somebody else later. But that could alter your perception of the scene in performance as opposed to watching it or reading it as a play. But I'm going to tell you, structurally, that's the climactic moment because it's the reversal of the argument. Once you've been introduced to the conflict, the reversal of that conflict structurally is the climactic moment. And of course, plays work best where both of those go hand in hand. I'm going to avoid any double entendre here at all, but usually if the climax is the same for everyone, we're in better space, yes? Which leads to what I call the the falling action. The falling action in the play, and again, here's a fun word, the denouement. I love it. The denouement, D-E-N-O-U-E-M-E-N-T. It's a French word meaning falling action. The conclusion. The denouement, the falling action, is what happens after the climax. It's where usually Clouseau will come in and tell you all the things that you didn't catch, or there'll be some point of the play or movie where you'll have a chance to breathe before the end of the play. Now, if you're watching some sort of scary movie, one of the things that people in scary movies love to do is to allow the climax to happen. You've got the chainsaw massacre coming in and gets stabbed and killed and chop their head off or whatever, and everybody's breathing easy. And just at the last moment, you're laying the flowers on the grave, and the grave hand comes from out of the grave and grabs your arm to scare you one more time. But that's a little trick of scary movies. That's not in Aristotle. Aristotle says you have the climax, and then you have the denouement, the part leading away from the climax that allows you to reconnect to the reality, to get your eyes back to the fifth paragraph in your 5-paragraph essay. Yes. So again, according to Aristotle, those are the 4 parts of the plot: the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action. Yes. All right. Moving on. Characters. According to Aristotle, there are 4 aspects of character. First of all is what he calls the physical aspects. This is how, whether they're a man, whether they're a woman, whether they're fat, whether they're skinny, whether they're bald, whether they got blonde hair, blue eyes, just the physical characteristics. Oedipus has big feet. That's what we know about her. Lysistrata is a female. That's what we know about her. Yes? And so sometimes you're limited as to your physical awareness of the character, but it's what separates one character from another. The mental or ethical aspects of the characters, their education level, how smart they are, if they have common sense. Again, we talked about my grandfather the other day, has very limited actual education, but has a great deal of common sense. So that'd be their mental aspects. Emotional aspects. Again, this is way before Freud, so psychology really doesn't enter to Aristotle's treatment, but it's the same. You understand psychology. So it's whether you're happy, whether you're sad, whether you're an optimist, whether you're a pessimist, whether you see the glass half empty or half full. All those things are the part of the emotional characteristics of the character. And the last component is the social aspect. I'm a professor, you're a student, and that arrangement could change. For instance, you might work as a teller at a bank, and I become the patron, right? I'll walk in wanting to cash my check. Whatever. Don't laugh if it happens. We get paid when we get paid. But our social relationship could change depending on the situation. But right now, I'm a professor, you are a student, and so there's a certain decorum that we follow, yes? In that relationship. But that's the social aspect. Cool? Now, again, one of the things that Aristotle is trying to do is to prove that theater belongs in a utopian society. That's his the thesis for his argument. And the first foray into that area is when he starts talking about these particular types of character. Aristotle says, first of all, there is in a tragedy, there is this person called the protagonist. Yes? The protagonist is the person you cheer for, the person who you're rooting for, the person that you're hoping is going to win. Yes? Now, in America, in the late 60s, there was this movie called Bonnie and Clyde, in which Bonnie and Clyde are the protagonists, but they're the anti-heroes. That's one of the things about American theater, American drama, is we've created bad people who we root for, the anti-hero. But for the most of history, the protagonist was a good person that you wanted to win and do well. And I'm going to say, in Oedipus, it's pretty easy. Who do you think the protagonist in Oedipus is? If you said Oedipus, you're correct. Who do you think the protagonist in Lysistrata is? Now, if you said Lysistrata, I'm going to say you're not incorrect. The problem is in the two scenes that we talked about as being the climactic scene of the play, the scene between Marine and Canisius, and the scene where you sign the peace treaty, Lysistrata is not in either one of those scenes. So instead of being particularly the protagonist in Lysistrata, I'm going to say more broadly, double entendre, get it? Broadly. It is the women. I'm going to say it is not just Lysistrata, it is the women as a whole who are the protagonists in Lysistrata. Does that make sense? Women's power or war against, an anti-war play. Either way, the women are against somebody else. Yes? And who that person is or thing is the antagonist. The protagonist who you're rooting for, the antagonist is the conflict or the person who is in the way of the protagonist achieving their goal. Yes? The bad guy. Now, ironically, we talked about irony. Ironically, in Oedipus, who is the antagonist? I'm going to say it's Oedipus. It could be Creon, except that Creon, I think, is doing everything he can. Oedipus certainly questions Creon's motives at one point. But I'm going to say ultimately we find out that Oedipus is the antagonist as well, ironically. Yes? In Lysistrata, who is the antagonist? Or what is the antagonist? If the women are the protagonist, the problem with the men being the antagonist is at the end of the play, the women go off singing and dancing with the men, and they want the men. I'm going to say the antagonist is war. Yes? So again, the antagonist can be a thing. Doesn't have to be a person. Yes, even though in Oedipus it is. And usually it may, in most plays it's not this difficult to understand. That's why one of the reasons we read these two plays. Anyway, the antagonist is who you're against. And there is, according to Aristotle, the protagonist, by definition, the protagonist in a tragedy is a tragic hero, is what he calls a tragic hero. And in order for a tragic hero to be effective in its use, Aristotle says the tragic hero should be perfect in every way, save one aspect, that's his tragic flaw. He uses the example of, who's the guy, Achilles, yes? In the story of the Iliad, not to ruin the Iliad for you, I know you're all going to read it this weekend. In the story of the Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan War, the war's over. The horses happened, the people have done, Apollo's been throwing his lightning bolts, everything's happened. The very last action in the book or the play, Achilles is standing there shooting his arrows, and one of the Trojan soldiers who's about to die takes his bow and arrow and shoots an arrow into the sky, and tragically it hits Achilles in his heel. Now Achilles was born, his father was Zeus, and his mother was a human woman. And so she prayed to Zeus to save, because her son was half God, to save her son. And he said, if you could go to the river Styx and dip him in the river without you touching the river, Zeus will protect any part of Achilles that is in the water. And so she takes him to the river and dips him in, holding him by his heel. Yes, and that's why it's called an Achilles heel. She holds him by his heel and she dips him out. And of course, the last thing to happen in the Iliad is the arrow strikes Achilles in the heel. Now, I don't want this to happen, but I think if someone were to shoot me in the ankle with an arrow, I think I might be able to survive. I don't know, and I don't want you to do this. I don't want to see. But I think it's not a mortal wound, typically. But in Achilles' case, it was, because it was the one part that Zeus did not protect, and therefore it was his flaw. Yes? And so Aristotle says, like Achilles has his flaw, a true tragic hero should have one thing wrong with him, which is where these scholars go back and look at Oedipus and say that he was prideful. Why? Because they're trying to give him a tragic flaw. Why? Because Aristotle says that a good tragic hero should have a tragic flaw. Does Oedipus really have a tragic flaw? Not in my reading. I would disagree with scholars who say that pride is his weakness. If you read it that way, great, you were on the side of the scholars. But in my reading of it, Achilles is doing everything he can to escape his fate. And really the lesson you learn is you cannot escape your fate. The truth will come out. Yes, he is blind to the truth. I would say that's his flaw, is that he is unwilling to accept and or discover his truth. Yes, and so again, those, to me, that's the lesson I learned. But again, different lessons for different people. But again, Aristotle says that the fact that an audience of 20,000 people can learn this type of lesson without having to experience the discomfort, the pain of loss in reality, makes theater a more valuable aspect of a utopian society than not having it. In other words, I'll make it much simpler. Let's just say we have a stove, and when you teach people not to touch the stove, it's hot. We do a play, I walk in, I touch the stove, it's hot. I say, oh, I burned my fingers, please don't touch the stove. Most people watching the play would say, oh, look, that's a bad idea. Now, Cody would still go up in his stove and touch the stove and say, man, he was right. But not me. Yes? So again, theater can be used to teach others how to behave correctly, yes, or better. A little bit about the tragic hero. I know it's a difficult concept, so I'm going to let you watch a little video about the development of the tragic hero.
The story goes something like this. A royal, rich, or righteous individual, who otherwise happens to be a lot like us, makes a mistake that sends his life and the lives of those around him spiraling into ruin. Sound familiar? This is the classic story pattern for Greek tragedy. For thousands of years, we've spun spellbinding tales that fit this pattern, and modern storytellers around the world continue to do so. 3 critical story components, influenced by Aristotle's Poetics, help us understand the allure. First, the tragic hero should be elevated in rank and ability, but also relatable. Perhaps he is a king, or extraordinary in some other way. But because you and I are neither unusually good nor unusually bad, neither is the hero. And he has one particular tragic flaw, or hamartia, something like ambition, tyranny, stubbornness, or excess pride that causes him to make a critical mistake. And from that mistake comes disaster and downfall. As an example of these elements in action, let's look to Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, about a man who doesn't know he was adopted and is warned by an oracle that he's destined to murder his father and marry his mother. In trying to escape this fate, he kills a man who won't get out of his way at a crossroad. He then cleverly answers the riddle of the monstrous Sphinx, freeing the kingdom of Thebes from a plague. He marries the widowed queen and becomes king. But after he finds out that the murdered man was his father, and the queen he married is his mother, Oedipus gouges out his eyes and retreats into the wilderness. At the beginning of his story, Oedipus is elevated in ability, and he's elevated in rank. He's neither unusually evil nor saintly. He's relatable. Notice the height of the fall. Once a king, but now homeless and blind. It's more tragic, after all, if a king falls from a tall throne than if a jester falls off his stepstool. Oedipus's tragic flaw is hubris, or excessive pride, and it causes him to attempt to avoid the fate prophesied for him, which is exactly what makes it happen. He's a particularly unlucky soul because his mistake of killing his father and marrying his mother is done in complete ignorance. Of course, these narrative principles transcend classic Greek tragedy. In Shakespeare's canon, we see Hamlet's indecisiveness lead to a series of bad decisions, or perhaps non-decisions, that culminate in the death of almost every character in the play. And Macbeth's ambition catapults him to the top before sending him careening to his grave. Even modern pop culture staples like Game of Thrones and The Dark Knight resonate with the tropes Aristotle identified over 2,000 years ago. So what's the point of all of this suffering? According to Aristotle, and many scholars since, a good tragedy can evoke fear and pity in the audience. fear of falling victim to the same or similar catastrophe, and pity for the height of the hero's downfall. Ideally, after watching these tragic events unfold, we experience catharsis, a feeling of relief and emotional purification. Not everyone agrees why this happens. It may be that empathizing with the hero allows us to experience and release strong emotions that we keep bottled up. Or maybe it just lets us forget about our own problems for a little while. But regardless of how you feel when you watch Poor Oedipus, never has there been a more salient reminder that no matter how bad things get, at least you didn't kill your father and marry your mother.